everyone, and welcome to Globe Anew, the podcast where we explore how young people around the world are shaping our future, our cities, and our planet. Today's episode is a special one. We're joined by someone whose work has redefined how we think about youth, education, and urban change. Professor Deborah McKoy from UC Berkeley is the executive director of the Center for Cities and Schools. Her work lives at the intersection of educational reform, urban planning, community development, and public policy. But more than anything, she's a champion of youth voices and their power to transform the cities we live in. So let's dive in. Professor McKoy, thank you so much for joining us. I've been looking forward to this conversation, and you've been really great and professional with logistics and cooperation. To start us off, how are you doing today?
Thank you. I'm doing really well. Just back at the office after several weeks away. So nice to have the opportunity to talk with you.
Yeah, well, I mean, for me, it's early August, and in Northern California, where I'm from, it's still quite warm, but also cooling down a bit. So I'm happy to hear that you're doing well. So let's get into our first big question.
Okay.
Professor McKoy, you devote a huge part of your career to helping young people make a difference. But some of our viewers might ask, why is it even important to involve young people in city planning decisions?
Sure. Well, I think I've been involved in city planning and community development for over 25 years, first in New York and then nationally and globally, and now the last 2 decades here in California. And I think what is so surprising is how we take for granted the important role young people play in our cities. From 0 sort of to 18, when young people are particularly in school, it's not only young people, but it's young people and schools are really thought of as an integral part of how we activate our cities, even though they're often more than 50% of a population, particularly in the lowest income areas. And so just from a very pragmatic standpoint, we're just not going to realize the goals we have for vibrant, healthy, joyful cities unless we better understand, A, who are the young people who live there, and B, how do they use the city? And most importantly, how do they want to use the city? So how can we really reinterpret the places that we live and learn and play and through the eyes of young people and different ages too. Elementary school students are incredibly insightful about how they use place, and just from the height, it's really pragmatic things, like just their height and their experience of the city is very different because we design buildings for adults. And even though we say they're supposed to be child-friendly cities, they're still designed for adults. Not with or for young people.
That perspective is so powerful because often when we think of designing cities, we often go to thinking about cars and how's like the traffic gonna work, and when we think of pedestrians, often like an adult pedestrian comes to mind.
It's actually one of the most important issues that you raise in our cities, which is the use of transportation and sidewalks, because young people don't drive, so they are enormous consumers and users of our sidewalks, of our public transportation systems, and one of the highest causes of, I hate to say it, but a young pedestrian fatality are cars. And young people, we just don't think about cars and transportation for young people. And so from a pure public safety standpoint, transportation absolutely has to be not only thought of from an adultist perspective about how young people might use spaces or how their assumptions are that they use transportation and sidewalks, but really how do they want to use it? So if we can, develop ideal cities, it's really around the safety of young people and transportation and sidewalks, and just the role of pedestrians is really, really important from a youth perspective.
There's a lot of work to do in this area because it's just been pretty historically overlooked. Your work at the Center for Cities and Schools, it's really been a pretty big factor and a pretty vocal part of this push for change towards more equitable cities. And for the audience, the Center for Cities and Schools is an action research center that helps connect young people and students with the world around them. Actually, I'd like to ask, how did the Center for Cities and Schools come to be, and what makes its approach unique?
Well, it's a funny story, actually. I had been doing a lot of work in public housing. I'd come out to Berkeley for graduate school in education. And I was in Chicago doing work for HUD. the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. And I was doing some consulting around how to build more equitable, what we call mixed income housing developments. They were trying to transform a lot of the traditional public housing, what's known as housing projects, and kind of the greatest concentrated poverty in a lot of our cities, into mixed income, much more healthy and vibrant communities for everybody. And I was asked early on about families and realized that there was absolutely no connection between literally blowing up these giant public housing developments in Chicago and where the kids went to school. So literally when the first public housing developments were blown up, and this was an old housing policy of 25 years ago, under President Clinton, they depopulated the local school, but they never told the school that this was happening. So school started without realizing about the loss of an enormous amount of their population who lived in public housing. And I was like, how the heck can there not be any greater communication and policy connection between housing in particular at that point, and public education in particular, because it's much more neighborhood-based placement. And that kind of got the idea in my head about forming some type of research and policy understanding between cities and schools. And I came back to Berkeley, and I was doing my graduate work. And I said, it just is crazy that the College of Environmental Design and City Planning is literally on the opposite side of campus from education. And it became a metaphor for how deeply divided these two disciplines are. And so we started with our first projects about really trying to understand what is the relationship of, again, one of the most obvious ones that doesn't get addressed enough is transportation, right? Like, how do kids in school need to use public transit to get to school on time? How do you make it more efficient for them? Like, how do we really make transportation work for public school success instead of just being a reactive response to whatever the routes are that are there? So from a housing perspective, it was do not blow up public housing or any housing without really talking and working with the local community that can really be a partner in redevelopment efforts. And that really inspired. We spoke to the dean of education and then the former dean of the college and said, what if we were to start a center, just really looking at this issue? And I had some grants from HUD and some other projects, and I said we can use that as seed funding. The college gave us some seed funding and some offices, and that's how it got started. And then I worked with a colleague of mine who was doing his PhD, Jeff Vincent, in how actually sharing school infrastructure around joint use. So you could share a library or share a pool, right? Really physical infrastructure, relationship changes, relationship building between cities and schools. So I said, Jeff, you want to start the center with me? He goes, yeah. And 25 years later, we're still here doing, actually it's 20 years. We started in 2004. But the Y-Plan work, where I work with young people in schools, which I think we'll get to next, that actually predated the center.
It's incredible to hear how the model is built around seeing students and young people's needs and their different characteristics where they need to use transportation. So you also need to trace back where that goes. And your strategy isn't just talking at young people and just telling them what they need. So that leads me to my next question. In what ways have you seen students actually shape their cities or schools through your programs? And what does that impact look like in real life?
Sure. Before even my trip to Chicago, when I was doing my dissertation, and I think I'm not just a born writer, so I had to still be engaged with young people, even though I was doing my dissertation on how do you activate classes around like productive learning, we call it. So like newspapers or radio stations where young people are actually having a public purpose for their work. And I was studying that. And then I was invited to give a lecture on the Department of City Planning about housing, because I'd also been paying for grad school through my work with HUD and in part. And I said, oh my God, this is amazing. You're actually going into schools as city planners and teaching them about how places just aren't taken for granted, about how there's a lot of intentional design and planning that goes into a city. And I was like, oh my God, this is so amazing, because I'm actually focusing on city planning, which is very unusual for education. And it's kind of funny, that teacher who was teaching the class ended up leaving, and they asked if I would want to teach it. And I'm like, oh my God, this is my dream. I so much rather teach than just write. And so I started teaching, and I created a class which created basically around this idea of teaching young people and city planning as part of how we teach city planners to plan our cities in the future. And that was in 2000, that was 25 years ago. And that started the Y Plan initiative. I got grants over the years, and it's still a class that I teach today about how future city planners need to understand the role of young people in schools in our cities. And so that actually predated my visit to Chicago. So I'd been teaching about the concept before I actually saw how disconnected the policies were in practice. And so young people, we really say they're the heartbeat of the Y Plan work, is really the heartbeat of the Center for Cities and Schools, because it keeps us very humble and focused on the lived experience of young people, whether it be transportation or housing or public space, or even school services and amenities is an important thing for young people to be a part of, but always centering understanding of place in cities around young people.
I see. What you're saying is that the Y Plan heavily involves a lot of students and the different changes that they want to make, and then it provides a space for them to actually execute that change.
Yeah, I mean, the Y Plan is in grad school, and you're still in high school, but you think about a project that you might do. In graduate school, the way we teach city planning is that you do a master's degree, and one of the requirements is called a studio class, where you're actually working on a real project. And I said, well, high school kids need to do that too, So the Y Plan is actually designed on graduate school work here at Berkeley, where young people are given a consulting project. So for example, you asked about some examples. The last 5 years, I've been really working hard on the role of rising homelessness within our schools. So for the past 5 years, a lot of our Y Plan projects have all been focused around the needs of unhoused young people. And in Oakland, there was one academy that every year did a studio project in high school. It's a career academy, which is a small school within schools. I don't know if they have that in your school, like a magnet, like a small school. So their project was they actually worked for the city and the Department of Homeless Services around, and the school district's homeless education department as clients, because they said, how can we improve our services to really reduce, first off, to reduce chronic absenteeism, which is one of the biggest issues, of course, facing students who experience homelessness. And then what can we do as schools to respond? And one of the first cohorts of kids says, well, the first thing that they recommended, and they spoke to the whole school board, is you have one homeless education coordinator, and I identified 1,200 young people who are experiencing homelessness in the District of Oakland, California. How can one person adequately address the needs of 1,200 students? So it was a public meeting, and adults often respond more quickly to young people than they do even to adults. And within 3 months, they reallocated funding and hired 3 new caseworkers to support the unhoused students of the school district of Oakland, California. That's just one example. They all don't have to be that dramatic, because that actually, you have to require the funding for that. But, smaller examples are, how do you understand the transportation needs when students it's called highly mobile, because when you're unhoused, the majority of students, 80%, are actually not on the street. They're actually living on couches. They're called couch surfing. They're going from home to home, wherever they can find a place to stay for the night or the week, or sometimes even a month, but they're moving all the time. So how can we make the public bus services more clear, and trains and whatever else that systems can be used for? So kids just suggested having a much clearer relationship with the local transit agency, because we may not be able to change the routes right away, but we can make alternative routes available to the students who move a lot. And so sometimes it doesn't cost a lot of money. Sometimes it really is about understanding the information needs of young people and getting that information to the young people that need it most. So there are a lot of community schools in California. So community school coordinators or counselors can have services and information for the numbers of students who experience such high mobility and move around, whether it's from homelessness or foster care or the justice system. It's sort of an invisible, very, very high need population that only through the insights of their peers were we able to understand how cities can better and school districts can better respond to their needs. We worked with Japan for 12 years. That was the biggest one we've done. That's really funny. It's the biggest project we worked on. In 2011, there was the awful tsunami and earthquake that happened in Tohoku, Japan. And so for the past 12 years, we brought over 1,000 young people to the US to learn about why plan and redevelopment, then go back home to rebuild Tohoku, Japan. And that was by far the biggest and I think most interesting project we ever did through Y-Plan, and it's global. We actually just did a story map on it. So we have a lot around Japan here. And I did some op-eds, so different articles are on here, different things that happen. That was a Berkeley article, but there was a decade of resilience. We did that was the brief, but no, the story map is much better. Story map has to be here. You know story maps?
I haven't heard of them before. What are they?
They're fantastic, easy websites to tell a story, a narrative story. And we use them a lot in planning because you can use a lot of data. So this will tell you the whole decade of resilience about the Tomodachi program.
Wow.
The Japan, and it just kind of tells a story, and it was started by the ambassador of Japan. And it's an interactive website, and the different partners, and it tells you the different Y-Plan projects that they did and how they use the framework. Like it's a 5-step process. So it's just a really nice way of telling a story about the work. It's so much better. And these are different projects that they worked on in the community here, and then they went back home to impact changes at home. I'll just share this link with you.
Thank you so much.
You can read a website or just go through a story map rather than reading a long paper.
This sort of thing seems like the future. I mean, there's so many visual learners and readers in the world.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And how we can use data differently. So that's also really important.
That's awesome.
Okay. Toshi was one of my students who started in Tomodachi, the Japan program, and then created his own. So he then grew this in Japan himself in Tomorrow City, the Y-Plan project in Japan.
Hearing these stories reminds me of just how often adults underestimate youth or they misread, which brings me to something that I think maybe a lot of the viewers and I have experienced. What do adults and policymakers often misunderstand about young people and what they're capable of?
Great question. I'd love to hear your perspective on that too, as a student leader, clearly. I think the fundamental need is actually, in addition, of course, to the basics of, our basic needs of shelter and food, right? Like basic needs. The most important absolute part of their life that's missing are loving relationships and consistent relationships. And we know from wellness research, we know from longevity research, the number one thing facing or improving a life of happiness is connection, right? But we do our first approach is to do structural changes like bus route, which is really important. But I'll tell you before that, what young people say is so important is just to have an adult who really gives a damn about them and is there not just once, but consistently. And so I think putting first and foremost, how can each of us, every single person involved in the system, whether it's higher ed or elementary school or a community organization or a transit agency, how can we really see the humanness in every young person and the dignity that they have and deserve to have a better life in and outside of schools, right? Schools can often be, schools and church is honestly one of the only guaranteed public institution in a youth community or a child's community. how can we not see the humanness of relationships formed between those institutions and the young people, the people who are driving these institutions? It just, time after time after time, that is what young people say more than anything else. They just want some adult to care and to help. Then they get trust, and then they can make decisions differently. But young people will not make decisions differently unless they trust the person that's giving them the advice, right?
No, yeah, I definitely understand where you're coming from here, because I would not be here today if it weren't for like a team of adults that I can rely on. That's how I get here right now. I feel like oftentimes when it comes to needs, and I feel like I can see this in some of the adults around me, where if a young person brings up a problem, an issue, or they want to see some change, adults just jump in and try and do things the adult way, which is large-scale structural changes and doing like itemized steps, like a list of whole different things that they want. Like you should. I feel like that sort of attitude or instinct might just widen the gap, the communication gap between young people and adults.
Exactly.
Well, that disconnect can be frustrating, but it also sets the stage for some really surprising outcomes. Professor McKoy, can you share a story about a youth-led initiative that even surprised you with its impact?
Honestly, the one I just shared, I think, was the one I'd say has been one of the most impactful for me in all these years of doing this work. I feel like because it started with housing in Chicago, literally 25 years ago, to, just last year working with young people in Oakland and other cities around increasing, skyrocketing levels of homelessness around within schools. So I think that was definitely one of the most impactful areas of work that we've had in the last 5 years. I think that my husband's often like, well, the Y plan, you do it every year for so many years. And I'm like, it's just a framework, because every time you engage in a different question with a different set of students, including my own students here at Berkeley, it transforms everything, right? That people are, if you really listen, then everything is new and provocative and needing of fresh eyes. So I think those were definitely, that's definitely the most impactful. And I think actually another initiative that we did that I think I learned most, because I hadn't really been involved in climate change work or resilience work too much, which is of course a big thing for every discipline, right? If you can't just study environmental studies now, it's climate change is impacting housing and transportation and every part of a young person's life. But there was a year-long competition that was funded by the MacArthur Foundation called Resilient by Design. Rockefeller Foundation, excuse me. And we were invited to do a parallel challenge, inviting young people from across the whole Bay Area region. And so I think we had over 10 cities involved in that, and the schools. And I got to know the region because it's the Bay is huge. And, you live in the Bay Area, and the difference in how Vallejo experiences the Bay, and then San Francisco or Oakland, and then in Southern Cal, or the South Bay. And so to hear young people's experience of sea level rise already, there are some towns along the Bay that have been experiencing flooding for years, right? Where it is totally new to other parts of a city like Oakland. So I think that was one of the most impactful personally. I think the young people made a difference in terms of their recommendations, but I think I personally learned the most because I didn't just hear about climate change policies, but I learned about it through the eyes of young people who were growing up with the fires and the flooding, and how the sea, the Bay was literally engaging in their lives in beautiful ways also, right? About how the Bay was such an important part of their life. So that was a really interesting and kind of humbling project.
I like these examples a lot, because what they do is that they just prove that young people are perfectly capable of making change. I know that in my city, a lot of the city level decision making that our wonderful city council attempts to involve youth. At the end of the day, a lot of these structured city-sponsored projects where youth are allowed to make change, it only really boils down to like planning events or just doing some paperwork and things like that. But your examples right here just prove that we are perfectly capable of making larger change beyond just planning or paperwork, because all we really need is just the trust from the adult population and the trust that they put in us to use responsibility wisely.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So what kinds of policies would you most like to see implemented to promote equity in urban development, especially when it comes to youth involvement?
I think carving out a space for new, the way plans generally get developed and then implemented, is that cities will hire consultants. There's usually not a huge internal city planning department. There's a department, but they often do the work in contracting with firms and groups that do it. And it'd be really nice if there was some type of requirement for not just community involvement, which is typically you have to have some type of check off that you've been engaging with the community. And I'd say the vast majority is not done very well. Some firms do a really good job about community engagement, but there's rarely a call out for young people. One of which is hard because legally, you can't work with minors unless you have parent involvement, which is why it's so helpful to work with schools. So I actually work with schools because then it's part of their classroom and the teachers are in charge, not us. So it makes it much more accessible to work with schools, work with young people. So I think just carving out and incentivizing the need, not just that it's nice to have young people's involvement, but it's necessary to have young people's perspective and really understand the power of perspective when we reimagine and then plan for and design new cities and implement, new cities. So that's the number one starting place for me. And then the other is to really ask the questions that policymakers, it's sort of, I think I focus more on the process because I think the structures themselves will change if the process changes, right? Transportation policy, sidewalk development will change if the process about how do you redevelop streets changes such that you realize you need to understand young people's experience and use of the place that you're planning for. So I think I back into it and really thinking about not just what needs to change physically or in infrastructure, which is a lot of what planning is about, but to back up and say, how do we think differently about the places that we live?
Oh my. Oh, these are some very good points that you bring up here. I really like how you keep emphasizing the need for transportation right here, because as a young person, that's really it's kind of a deciding factor as to whether or not you can do the things that you want to do. Yeah. Because, the United States is not quite a walkable place, as we all know. It's just miles and miles of highway stretching all around. So if we can have transportation and the freedom to move around, then it's a game changer, really. Finally, for the young people listening right now who want to create change but might feel overwhelmed or unsure to begin, what sort of advice would you give them?
I think it goes back to relationships and having the courage to form relationships with people that you don't necessarily think will value your opinion. Find a place at the table and be ready when you get there. I worked with the Obama administration, and there were some leaders when they were working with us on why plan at a national level. And we had one great young leader who had done a lot around campaigning say, what advice do you have for the 100 young leaders in the room? And he said, be ready, because opportunities come, but most people aren't ready when it's there. So be ready, be confident enough that your voice really matters, and form the relationships, give time to form relationships with adults who you don't think will listen, but they often will care more than you might expect. And not just care, but actually connect at a deeper level. Whether it's in your school or anywhere, it's just so much about connection and trust, and finding the right people. I was not a traditional student. I found people that found something in me that was different, and then they helped me navigate the places that I went to school and continued my work.
There's a change in the culture around how young people interact with adults that's slowly developing right now. Because, for example, in my Bay Area little bubble here, there's a huge culture around you should reach out to as many adults as you can, just email them. And I feel like this change is a good thing, because eventually over time people will feel, I guess, less intimidated, less scared to reach out to the experts that they want to talk to.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so that's all the questions I have today. Thank you so much, Professor McKoy, for sharing your time and wisdom with us today.
You're clearly a young, growing, inspiring leader, so thank you.
No, thank you for all the work that you do. Your work reminds us that young people don't need to wait to be heard. All they need to do is just be included, to be a voice in the room, to find a place at the table. And to everyone listening, whether you're a student, educator, or community member who feels inspired by this conversation, go check out the Center for Cities and Schools. We'll have links on YouTube and on our Globe Anew website. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this episode if it resonated with you. And stay tuned for more conversations about how youth are transforming the world around them. Thanks for listening. See you next time. Bye.